All right, so everybody in the class already knows how to solve linear equations, but now we need to know how to solve equations that are quadratic, or equations with the highest degree being a squared or a second power. So today we discussed in class the zero product rule, and that's really important for you to understand in order for us to be able to solve these problems. So using the zero product rule, now let's look at question number 4, which is on page 3. On question number 4, it's set equal to 0. This expression right here is set equal to 0, which means I can factor this expression to solve this entire equation. So I'm going to look through and ask my 3 questions. Is there GCF? No, there isn't. Is it a difference of perfect squares? It is not, because it's not a binomial. 10 and 7 are not perfect squares, and we have a plus sign here. So my third question is, can I factor it into the product of two binomials, which I can. Now my choices are to use trial and error, or I can use the factor by grouping. Because the leading coefficient is 1, I think it would be easier for me to use factor by grouping. I know the factors would be -5 and -2, because -5 multiplied by -2 is +10, and -5 plus -2 is -7. So when I factor this, it ends up looking like x minus 5 multiplied by x minus 2 equals 0. Now, because I have the product of two binomials equal to 0, I can automatically conclude that one of these factors could possibly be 0. So I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. So my first factor would be x minus 5, and I'm going to set that equal to 0. And then my second factor is x minus 2, and I'm going to say that also equals 0. And then in order to solve this first equation right here, I would add 5 to both sides, which means that x equals 5. And then here I would add 2 to both sides, which means that x equals 2. So that means that my final answer is going to be 2 and 5. Both are possible solutions to my quadratic equation above. Now, taking a look at question number 5, I can't go straight to factoring because these two pieces right here, although it's the product of two factors, it is not equal to 0. So these factors could be any possible number. There's an infinite number of possibilities, number of possibilities of numbers that could multiply together to give me 30. So I need to make sure that I get this 30 out of this side and on this side. But before I do that, I want to simplify this left side a little bit. So I'm going to distribute to figure out what the left side really is. I'm going to distribute this x through to everybody right here. So I end up getting x squared minus 8x. And then I'm going to distribute this 5 through to everybody. So I end up getting plus 5x minus 40. And that's all going to equal 30. So then I'm going to combine my like terms on this side right here. I end up getting x squared minus 3x minus 40 equals 30. Remember, my goal is to get this one of my sides equal to 0. Because my leading coefficient is positive on the left side, I'm going to keep it on the left side, and I'm going to get rid of this 30 by subtracting 30 from both sides. So what I end up getting is x squared minus 3x minus 70 equals 0. Now I have everything all on one side and a 0 on the other side, so I can go through and factor this, and I know that this is going to be the product of two binomials. So when I factor it, I'm going to look for two numbers that multiply together to give me -70, but add up to give me -3, and those factors are -10 and +7. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create my t-chart so that I can set each factor equal to 0. So x minus 10 equals 0, and x plus 7 equals 0, which means that x equals 10 and x also equals negative 7. So that would make my final answer positive 10 and negative 7. Now, number 6 is a lot trickier than it looks, so be very careful and pay extra close attention to this problem as we solve it. Because this has a squared in it, I'm going to solve it exactly like I solved all my other equations, and I'm going to get 0 on one side. Since the leading coefficient is this m squared, it has the highest degree, and it's positive, I'm going to keep this on this side, which means I need to get rid of this 7m. To get rid of the 7m, I'm going to subtract it. So minus 7m from both sides, subtract that 7m. I end up getting m squared minus 7m equals 0. Now, I go through my list of questions in order to solve this, and the first question I ask myself is there GCF? And there is. My GCF is m. So I'm going to factor this m out, and then I end up getting m minus 7. Do not forget your equals 0 every line, otherwise it is not an equation. So then I look and see, can I do any more factoring? Well, this is a monomial, so I can't factor this one any further. And although this is a binomial, it's not a difference of perfect squares, and there's nothing left in common, so this is factored completely. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my t-chart just like I do with all my other problems. And the first part of my t-chart is easy. I just set my first factor, which is m, equal to 0. And I don't even have to solve anything because m is isolated. I'm going to do the same thing with my second factor. So I get m minus 7 equals 0. I'm going to add 7 to both sides, which means that m is 7, which means that my final answer is going to be 0 and 7. Okay, so in number 7, if you notice, the leading coefficient here is negative, and it's a lot easier to factor if my leading coefficient is positive. So normally I would get rid of this negative 9y on this side and put it over here, but if I do, then I would still have a leading coefficient that is negative. So instead, I'm going to get rid of what's on the left side, and I'm going to put it on the right side. So instead of adding 9y, I'm actually going to get rid of this negative 2y squared by adding 2y squared. And I also want to get rid of the 4, so I'm going to add 4. So I'm going to add 2y squared to both sides. Don't forget to write that it's on both sides. And I'm also going to add 4. So these cancel, I have a 0 left over on the left side. Do not forget your 0, very important. And then I have all 3 of these terms right here. 1, 2, 3 terms, but I'm going to put it in descending order so that my format is an ax squared plus bx plus c. So the ax squared in this example is the 2y squared, the bx is the negative 9y, and the c is the positive 4. So now I'm going to go through my list of questions to factor this. There's no GCF, it's not a difference of perfect squares, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to put it as the product of 2 binomials. The leading coefficient is 2 right here. I could use trial and error, or I could use grouping. It is 100% completely your choice. I'm going to use trial and error because the leading coefficient of 2 is not that difficult. So I'm going to put 0 equals here, and then I'm going to look for 2 numbers that multiply together to give me 2y squared. So my only options are 2y and y. And then right here, I'm going to look for 2 numbers that multiply out to give me 4. I could use 4 and 1, or I could use 2 and 2. Let's try 4 and 1, see what happens. So I'm going to put a 4 here, and I'm going to put a 1 here. Now I'm just going to check with my carets to make sure that it works. I'm going to erase my carets eventually so it's not in my way. So right here, I end up getting 4y, and here, I end up getting 2y, and that does not give me the 9y that I want, so that doesn't work. So I'm going to try something different. I'm going to try to put the 1 here instead, and the 4 here, and see what I get. So this right here gives me y, this right here gives me 8y. When I combine the 8y and the y together, I can get a 9y if both y's both sets of y's are negative, which means that this 1 has to be a negative and this 4 has to be a negative. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to erase my carets right here. I'm going to completely get rid of them, and I'm going to set up my t-chart. So when I set up my t-chart right here, I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. So my first factor that I'm going to set equal to 0 is 2y minus 1. So I'm going to say 2y minus 1 equals 0. In order to solve this, my first step is to add 1 to both sides. So 2y equals 1. And then divide by 2, so I get y equals 1/2. I'm going to do the same thing with the second factor right here. I'm going to set it equal to 0. So I get y minus 4 equals 0, which means that y equals 4. Now that I've isolated the y in both equations, I have my answer. My answer to this question is going to be 1/2 and 4. All right, last question. If the solution set to a quadratic equation is 1, -4, what is the equation? So this time I'm given the answer and I'm going to work backwards. So what I'm going to do, before we move on, I just want to be very clear, there are several right answers for this question. I'm going to show you the most basic right answer, okay? So I'm going to say that my answers are x equals 1 and x equals -4. Now remember, this resulted from the product of two binomials being set equal to 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this one a 0 by subtracting 1 from both sides. This is the part that we did in our t-chart. So x minus 1 equals 0. I'm going to do the same thing with my other equation right here. So I'm going to add 4 to both sides. So I end up getting x plus 4 equals 0. So let's look back at this previous example. Here's my answer. Here are my solutions written out as y set equal to the numbers. Then here, if I had subtracted 4 from both sides, this is how I get this y minus 4. Here, if I multiply both sides by 2, this is how I get 2y equals 1. And then if I subtract 1 from both sides, that's how I get 2y minus 1 equals 0. So now that I have my two expressions set equal to 0, I can take those two expressions and I can put them into my two binomials being multiplied together. So I can say that it's x minus 1 multiplied by x plus 4 equals 0. And then lastly, well, let's compare this to the previous example. See how we have 2y minus 1 equals 0? That was one of my factors. And then y minus 4 equals 0. Y minus 4 was my other factor. Now all I have to do is take my two factors right here and distribute it. So I'm going to distribute this x to everybody. So I end up getting x squared plus 4x. Take the -1, distribute it to everyone. So I get -x minus 4. And then I've got equals 0. All that's left for me to do is to combine my like terms. I end up getting x squared plus 3x minus 4 equals 0. Now let me remind you, there are several possible answers that you could get as long as when you set each factor equal to 0, you end up getting 1 and -4 as your answers.